Technical change now? Or? Oh, I keep going. Okay. And this worries me. And the antidote, because periodically you'll say, well, the antidote is people have to read other media. Like, if you're left, read the right media. If you're right, read the left. I know very few people who do that. I do it because it's my job, because I'm in the media, and if I don't know, so I subscribe to all kinds of magazines and newspapers, and but that's because I get paid to do that. If you're a plumber or an electrician or a school teacher and you're exhausted from working all day and taking care of kids, you don't say, well, it's 11:30 at night, I'm just going to search 17 websites to make sure that I'm completely diverse in my political reading. Like, it's not a realistic way to look at human behavior. People usually will read the news for a couple of reasons. One, they want to be entertained. So it's sports, sex, and celebrities. If you look at what 90% of people follow on Twitter, it's those three. And the people who are reading news usually are looking to have their confirmation bias. Like they're looking to get their own views read back to them. And they read columnists who are telling them what they already think. It's sort of a form of therapy almost, because it assures them that they're right. There's been very interesting studies done by marketing executives where they look at people, they film people when they're reading a magazine, and they look at their eyes when they get to automobile ads. People linger the longest on ads for cars they own because it's comforting to read about how great their own product is, because it confirms that they've made the right decision. Like, oh yeah, Fords are awesome cars. It shows that I'm smart for buying this car. This is useful information. Thank you, Ford Motor Car Company. And it's the same with politics, right? My in-laws, who I visit in Florida at Del Boca Vista every winter, they happen to be liberal in their political outlook. Like Rachel Maddow is on everything, MSNBC. And Rachel Maddow is not supplying them with information. Rachel Maddow is supplying them with a spirited, funny, professionally delivered take on views they already have, and is saying what they believe in a confident, performative way. And the same is true on Fox, right? When those folks aren't sexually harassing their staff, they're on TV. That's why people are watching these shows, and it is a very worrying trend. And in a way, it makes us nostalgic for, when I grew up, there were 3 channels. There's CBC, CTV, and I think we could get one. Channel 11 was CTV, Channel 13 was CBC, this is Montreal, and I think Channel 20 was like some crappy Ottawa station. And that was it. And we had the Montreal Gazette, and I couldn't be in a silo, or if I was in a silo, it was a silo with everybody else, every other Anglo in Montreal. Now, if I went back in time, I'd be claustrophobic, because what? I have to wait another day for another newspaper, and that's all the news I get? That's awful. But at least the news I was getting was sort of down the middle. It was centrist. And I had a shared factual basis with people, so that the news I was reading had the same predicate and fact that the people I was meeting on the street were, my colleagues or fellow students, my family. We couldn't use alternative facts to support our argument, because we could make alternative arguments, but we all had to proceed from the same baseline of facts. So it does make me a little bit nostalgic. Sorry to repeat that. Yeah.
When I was a teenager arguing with my father in my typical fashion, he being conservative at the time and me being relatively radical to him, he ended one discussion with the idea that I should read his book. And that's my point, which is, have you seen the book called The True Believer? It's written by a sociologist named Eric Hoffer in 1951. It's not exactly a conspiracy theory, but it's the idea of allowing yourself to become very narrow in a view and being tied to that view. Some of the things you talked about, the cognitive dissonance. And it's just a little paperback, but it was certainly way ahead of its time.
It's called The True Believer?
The True Believer.
Oh, I should look at that.
Eric Hoffer.
Okay, I confess I haven't seen it, although it is the era of the sort of, I guess, the early era of John Birch Society and such, and which, John Birch Society, they accused of Eisenhower being a communist, and they had their own little siloed network but they did it, it was sort of bricks and mortar silos, right? Like they'd actually meet in people's homes, and the silo was the actual geography. So I'm going to check that out. Thank you. So did you?
Just like reflecting on what you said, I never looked at the conspiracy mindset as the way you categorize them in terms of like wanting to go back to the history, even though I think it's vision. But I always thought of it as, people are not sure and they cannot trust the politicians, maybe, so they look for answers. And I always refuted, I come from the Middle East, so we're the teams of...
Which part of those?
Lebanon.
Okay, cool. Yeah, lots of conspiracy.
Yeah. And so I always refused that way of thinking because it didn't make sense to me. And I think in 2005, maybe, or 6, someone posted a video of film, was done in 97. I can't remember her name, but they were talking about bombing the Trade Towers.
Right, okay.
And and we will accuse the Arabs for it. And I was like, is that a coincidence? And it made me, think of, maybe I'm wrong. Like, what is this coincidence? So I always thought about it that people that cannot trust the politicians. There's so much lies, so they try to find their own explanation to things. But
that's very interesting. Of course, I think 2005 was the tragic assassination of Lebanon's, which to this day justice has not been done.
Yeah.
Okay. And of course, that was a case in which you had governments lying all over the place because you have evidence of Hezbollah complicity and Syrian complicity, and of course, the person in Syria and Hezbollah don't. It wasn't us, it's just some incredibly gigantic bomb that blew up in the middle of Beirut without our help. So, if you're a citizen of a place like Lebanon, where real conspiracies sometimes do happen, it's not unreasonable to think that there are wheels within wheels within wheels. I should say that when I interviewed conspiracy theorists for my book, the most useful question that I asked wasn't, what do you believe? Because sometimes you say, what do you believe in? Like, they can go on for hours or days, and sometimes I already know what they believe because they've published books or blog posts. Most useful thing is saying, when did you believe this? When did you start believing this? Because I think you use the term trust and distrust, and usually you will get a narrative that says, here's where I lost faith in the universe. Like, here's where I thought I was being lied to. And one example was, there was a guy I interviewed for my book. He's he's actually a former CFL football player. He's a gigantic guy. He's an investment banker. And, he's a conspiracy theorist and believes all sorts of dark things. And I said, he happened to be Serbian. So he was originally born in Serbia, speaks Serbo-Croatian. That's the first time I thought he was fluent in English. And I said, when did you start believing all this 9/11 stuff? And he says, 1999. And the reason it's 1999 is because that's when NATO bombed his native country. That's when NATO started bombing Belgrade because the NATO campaign to liberate Kosovo. And there was a little bit of, I talked about the failed historian. He was a guy who just said, he couldn't process the idea of Serbia being a bad guy. Especially because, in his mind, understand this, throughout my history, we were taught that the Croatians allied themselves with the Nazis. And the Serbs were good guys and generally been responsible neighbors. And it's not, he had a narrative about history, but whether you accept that or don't, the fact he could not process the idea that NATO was going to war with Serbia for the reasons it said. It had to be something else. So, like he saw a video that was basically the murder of Kosovar Albanians, that this was filmed in a Los Angeles studio, and the whole thing was done as a pretext, and he had some very ambitious theories about how NATO wanted to invade Serbia, take this or that. But once he went down, so that was the moment that trust was broken. But once that moment happened, then everything, 9/11, vaccines, you name it. Because who's telling the truth about Kosovo? Alex Jones, maybe. InfoWars. I'm looking at the site. So he starts one of the 2 or 3 sites on the internet that are telling the truth about this. And guess what? Those sites are telling the truth about a lot of other things, whether it's the Jews or whatnot. And all of a sudden, he can cross-fertilize all the other conspiracy theories. But there often is one moment when people, and it isn't just often the government, it's often big business, religion, and media. Because this is the thing that most conspiracy theories it's not one conspiracy theory, it's two. Because it's the original conspiracy, right? To bomb the Twin Towers or whatever. But then the media has its own conspiracies to suppress the truth. Because you have to answer the question, well, this would be the story of the century. You know, George W. Bush bombs Manhattan. This will destroy the Republican Party for the next century. So why are people telling the truth? Oh, it's because NBC is owned by this and CBS. So you create a whole other conspiracy about the media. And in fact, and sometimes those conspiracy theories are even more ambitious. And that's why often there are people like that skeptical of me, because I'm part of the media, right? So if you are interested in the psychology of how these things take root, ask people when they started to believe these things. And also, I think it's important to conceive that if you look at the places where conspiracy theories are most popular, Pakistan, Iran, Nigeria, Lebanon, Egypt, they're places where real conspiracies have happened. And if you go to Iran, they'll say, you know, if you're talking to an Iranian or someone who's not from Iran, they will tell you that in the early 1950s, the CIA engaged in a real conspiracy to change the leadership of Iran. So if you're an Iranian and someone's telling you, oh, the CIA is conspiring to do this or that, so yeah, like they did in the 50s, like, you know, it's just within their living lifetime, they will often have evidence of that. Or if you're from Egypt, the 1956 war, the Suez War, there was essentially a conspiracy between France and England and Israel to create a pretext for war. It's true, like it's just a historical fact. So I would argue that these days those things are harder to do because we have more transparency, it's easier to leak information, it's more difficult for governments to create conspiracies. But you can see why people have these habits in mind. Because there is a historical precedent for it.
Is it also some people's personal identity gets wrapped up in their belief system? That they, their identity as to who they are, like whether it's their religion or whether it's their nationality. Also, I am this person and this is part of my identity because I believe these things.
Like a tribal identity. Yeah, and I have a chapter on those people. I think I call them campus revolutionaries. So they started as campus revolutionaries, and often these are people who bond with other people over this. And the example I give is a guy named Luke Rudkowski, I think his name is. Does anybody here remember a group called We Are Change? I think that was the name of the big t-shirts. They were sort of libertarians. They were guys who wore t-shirts that says, audit the Fed. They were into Ron Paul. People know who Ron Paul is. He was sort of a highly libertarian Republican. His son, Rand Paul, was one of the Republican presidential contenders. And as part of the research for my book, I went around New York with them. The highlight was when we stood outside Rockefeller's house and screamed slogans at them, you know, we will not join your New World Order. They're very into Alex Jones, like the people called the globalists. The idea that there's this global agenda led by the United Nations and people like Al Gore, Barack Obama, to assimilate America into a one-world government. But because the movement is dominated by people in their 20s, it becomes very tribal. And this becomes their identity. And I would say their identity is defined by the idea that most people in society are what they call sheeple. That is, they're quiescent. They don't ask questions. If given the choice between comfort and truth, they'll take comfort. And that they are a breed apart. So they have this identity as maverick, intellectually courageous truth seekers who will go wherever the truth leads them. They see themselves as rigorous empiricists who are the opposite of sentimental or tribal. They see themselves as rigorously intellectual in their outlook. And often these are very young people, and in this case, they're sort of right-wing, but to the question of whether there are tribes, it was very interesting because during the same trip in New York, I think it was on the 7th anniversary of 9/11 in 2008 or something like that. There was this event at, I think it's called St. Mark's Church in Lower Manhattan, where there was this like 9/11 truther event. And there were two groups of people. There were these We Are Change people in the 20s who were libertarian and conservative. And then there were these like older people, these Vietnam era people who were in their 50s and 60s who were these leftists who were talking about Chomsky and the neoconservatives, and they were like a generation apart, but it was clear that they were like two completely different tribes, and they didn't like each other. They did not like each other. So even within the 9/11 truther movement, there are people whose tribal identities, and the question was like, is this how they identify who they are personally? And the answer is yes. And it's a sub-niche of a sub-niche. So even within this narrow conspiracist field, there are even narrower fields. Or even within the 9/11 community, there's, what is it, they're called YHOPs. And YHOPs.
Make it happen.
Yeah, so YHOP is let it happen on purpose, and YHOP is made it happen on purpose. So there's these different theories about how the Twin Towers fell.
That's the part.
Tarpley, who I met when I was in Washington, and he brings 100 people with him to every gathering. He's strangely famous. So even within the 9/11 truther community, it's like YHOPs versus YHOPs. I don't remember if you ever taught your kids the Dr. Seuss book, The Sneetches, the Star Spangled Sneetches. There were some Sneetches that had stars and others that didn't. And so this guy comes to town and has a machine that he'll put stars on the tummies of the Sneetches, but then they don't want stars because it's unfashionable. So it's a parable of like consumerism. So that's kind of the way I see these people. No Dr. Seuss fans in Hudson. Yeah?
If I may, I'd like to ask you, if you don't mind, the engineering part of you.
Sure.
So, I don't consider myself a conspiracy theorist, but if I only had two words to say to you, it would be building 7.
Yeah, so WT7. So those of you who don't know, WTC7 was, it's not the Twin Towers. Yeah, it's another building. It's black. It's much lower than Twin Towers, and it collapsed a couple of hours later in the day on 9/11. And it's aroused suspicion for a few reasons. One was that I think a BBC broadcaster announced that it had fallen something like 20 minutes before it actually fell. Right. And there was, I believe it was a New York City firefighting chief who, when asked about the operation to send his personnel into WTC7 to fight the fire, indicated that it was likely, it turns out, that it was too dangerous, and he was going to pull it in the operation, which he did, and I don't think there was any loss of life in WTC7, unless I'm mistaken. No. Right. But the phrase pull it was seen as him admitting that the whole thing was rigged with internal explosives and that. I'm not a structural engineer, I'm a metallurgical engineer. So, and even within structural engineering, there are subspecialties in regards to demolition. Demolition, especially of modern skyscrapers, is an incredibly specialized field. But I do know enough about engineering to know some of the methods that are used to model engineering practices, including demolition. Whether it's planned demolition or whether it's buildings that fall down due to catastrophes. And I know that NIST, which is, I think, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, produced what was at that time one of the most comprehensive finite element method analyses to model the collapse of WTC7, alongside their separate report on the collapse of WTC1 and 2. And if you read that report, it is, from an engineering point of view, a meticulous analysis of everything that happened based on temperature data and time-lapse photography and all this stuff. If it were the case that there was some kind of inside job, and I think it was done at Purdue University, I think a lot of the engineering work for those reports was done at Purdue.
Stephen, the engineer, the thermite.
Oh yeah, I forget it. Right, yeah. So Hill Clinton was thermite, but we can get into that. But for you to believe that the NIST report was fraudulent, you have to believe that hundreds of engineers working at Purdue University and other centers of engineering excellence across the United States were somehow co-conspirators in this plot to find some alternative explanation for what was internal demolition. What the conspiracy theorists would tell you is that no. Really what brought down WPC7 and 1 and 2 was something called thermite. The thing is, thermite isn't even an explosive, it's a pyrotechnic. Not only is it a pyrotechnic, it's a pyrotechnic that has never in the history of planned demolition been used for this kind of operation, let alone an operation of this unparalleled sophistication. But they fastened on this on thermite because thermite generates temperatures in excess of 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit, which is the temperature required to melt steel, and a central point of the mythology of truthers is that some of the liquid you saw coming from the Twin Towers before they collapsed was molten steel. But on the other hand, both aircraft were filled with 30 tons of jet fuel, so that might have been a good.
Which doesn't burn at that temperature.
It burns at 1,500. It's essentially kerosene. Yeah, it burns at 1,500 Fahrenheit.
Right, and you need what?
You need 2,500 Fahrenheit to burn steel.
Okay.
So if indeed that was steel, that'd be curious, but we don't know that was steel. It could have been 100 other substances.
But so I've heard that the idea that I've had some conversations with some of the 9/11 conspiracy people, and some of them just get really obsessed to the point of just yelling. And there's one guy who's all red in the face, and I explained to him that when you put shape charges into the structural frame of the building, you have to cut into the structural frame. That means you're cutting into the steel structural support. And he says, well, you just get guys with torches. I mean, you realize the steel is over a foot thick. It's 110 floors of building, and you have to cut sections out of the steel, which is a foot thick, at least 6 or 10 inches blocks of the steel.
Cutting charges are called.
You need these cutting charges, and you need to remove this. Now, this is extremely heavy. I mean, the blocks will be the size of the weight of an engine block of a car. And you can't just throw them in the elevator. And then this would set off all of the heat detectors, thermal detectors, which are hardwired into the fire department, which would, any renovations would be, so you couldn't do this. And another thing is the structural support in London is either around the elevator shaft, which is internally concrete, so you have to remove the concrete, or it's in the outside frame of the building, which was not damaged, so when I was trying to explain to him, there's one guy, when they just read the CDs, it puts on the CD, why can't you answer the basic question? I answered the same thing with somebody else, and he said, well, maybe that's one explanation, but how do you know it wasn't blown up? And I said, there's another way of looking at this. There's very few people in the United States that had the capability of even demolishing a building like the World Trade Center, let alone an inhabited building. And who's going to do that? Who is going to say, put this stuff in the building? Like, how would you get people to modify their building, do all this dangerous work, risk getting caught, put it into an inhabited building, and think, well, they're just going to get paid for this. The whole person, it does not make any sense.
Well, yeah, it does sound ludicrous when you put it like that. I talked to one demolitions guy, and he'd say he would probably need access to the building for 4 or 5 months with nobody in it, just doing prep work. And he said if anybody was in it, they'd be severely injured because there'd be so much fumes, and like his own people would be wearing all kinds of protective gear. Because you're cutting through drywall, and you're cutting through concrete, and you're cutting through steel. There's also fire retardant material that creates building gases. And, I mean, in most office buildings, like people get upset because it smells so wacky from the restaurant, let alone like all sorts of industrial. So it's crazy, which is why 99% of the time when you're debating a conspiracy theorist, they won't want to be on that church, but they'll say, no, I'm just asking questions. And then they'll ask questions like, and some of them are interesting questions, like, why did the BBC broadcaster say this thing 20 minutes before WBC 7 fell? And as I said, there's this established canon of questions. Richard Gage is very good, Webster Charles is very good. And also, there's 47 questions they ask. And by the way, you can take any historical disaster or tragedy, and there's usually a whole bunch of questions because history is weird, and there are fairly well-known, the day Lincoln was assassinated, there's all kinds of weird questions about what happened then. History is weird and chaotic, and there's all kinds of little details that go unanswered. So it would be unusual. It sounds like the guy you were debating maybe he was like unusually adventurous in order to even give forth a theory, because usually the first trick of being a conspiracy theorist is to put the burden of proof on the other guy. Actually, it's the first trick of debating. Is the idea is the burden of proof is on you, so I'm going to ask you 50 questions, and if you can answer 49 of them, but you can't answer one because you don't have enough point of steel, so you don't have Wikipedia in front of you, well then I win the argument. And I always tell people, never debate a conspiracy theorist because the best you can do is a draw. Because they're going to give you 50 questions, and they know the answer, they practice it because they're life, and it's not your life. And unless you score 50 out of 50 on their Q&A, you lose. So so what I do is I divert. I don't want to sound manipulative, but I wrote a book about it, so I'd say, let's put this aside. Tell me when you started believing, because then you get interesting psychological information. Then I'm not like going to pro here, but as a journalist, I'm interested. I find it legitimately interesting to know, especially medical conspiracy theories, when a guy says to me, the whole big pharma, they're trying to get cancer. Tell me what, and often you'll hear very interesting, sometimes tragic stories, family members who died of cancer, or whatever, and you come to understand, and I don't want to be condescending, but sometimes these people have very sympathetic, unfortunate backstories, which has led them to this point in their life that they're battling with some nonsense. So I would say I would never argue with the conspiracy theorist. Even if you convince him, so what? Like this, what's in it for you? He's going to get angry. You're not going to learn anything. It's not like you're going to educate yourself. It's that thing, that cartoon strip XKCD, is that what it's called? The stick figures? XKCD? You recognize it if you saw it. There's a famous thing where the woman is going to her husband who's on the computer and saying, honey, come to bed, it's 2 in the morning, and he says, I can't. Somebody's wrong about something on the internet. and that's what happens when you're arguing, like when I'm arguing with my mom about global warming, I think global warming is bullshit. Life is too short for me. I'm not going to convince her. The reason she believes this isn't because of the science, it's because of some ideological thing. And so, I don't do it. It's not a good use of my time.